I've been working in applied AI since the early 1990s. I did a doctorate in applied AI, and I've also been the editor-in-chief of a scientific journal called Neural Computing and Applications since 1996. And that's been an interesting vantage point, I think, over the last 30 years to see how AI is developing, applied AI is developing. And the development of AI, I think we all recognize, we're in a boom period of AI, both from a scientific and academic point of view. And the journal that I've just mentioned, Neural Computing Applications, this year will receive almost 4,000 submissions from around the world. That's 4,000 pieces of individual applied research that we take through peer review and hopefully publish. The exponential growth that we've seen in submissions to the journal, I think, is not just a reflection of the journal being a good journal, but it's a reflection of the work that's being done around the world. And what's interesting is, having watched that over the period since I took on the role, of how the breadth of applications has expanded, but also how the technology has grown. And I think when you look at that and you see how powerful the technology of AI has become and how ubiquitous it has become, I think that gives it a really interesting kind of set of questions which emerge around where we're going with AI. I've seen applications of AI which as a technologist, as an applier of AI, which has really been my background, for which I can be very, very impressed in terms of the state of the technology, how clever the applications are, and how well done they are, and at the same time be very concerned about what the connotations and implications of those applications are. And it's that I really wanted to kind of explore this morning. Of course, we're in the middle of this extraordinary time with COVID-19, and it's natural, isn't it, that AI would be one of the tools we want to bring everything that we can to bear to try and beat back this virus and get back to our normal lives and recover the economy and recover the way we live. And early in the pandemic, applications of AI were being talked about and then developed, which might not always have been developed in the way that you would normally go through a rigorous process of ensuring, a bit like the development of vaccines, there was a whole conversation about making sure that they're both efficacious and safe. And some of the applications of AI in COVID-19 have been developed in ways as a kind of rush to judgment to get them out there, to get those applications available, which I think do cause some concern. What we've seen is applications which have been at the epidemiological end, big data models with AI technology embedded in them, which are being used as the decision support by politicians in this country and elsewhere to make fundamental choices about the way we live our lives, about life and death decisions, and about our economy. And colleagues will have seen, and the audience might have been involved and read about conversations around how robust those models really were. This is a new virus, and of course, basing models using AI, training AI on data from past experience, and then applying it to a completely new situation, carries with it the danger that the AI model becomes not robust in the face of a new situation. And anyone who's worked in AI and worked in big data knows that training big data models with small amounts of data is a flawed proposition from the start. And I believe that some of the epidemiological modeling has not been robust, and there's been a whole conversation around how those models have been used in decision support by politicians. I think added to that, there's also the issue of how models, particularly in medicine and healthcare, have been developed, which I think at times have also caused some ethical and application concerns. I'll give you a couple of examples. Certainly, as we all understand, COVID is a terrible, terrible, deadly disease and badly affects the lungs. And when health systems have become overwhelmed, we've seen around the world terrible, terrible pictures in the early days of the pandemic coming from Italy. And we're seeing doctors desperately trying to kind of, treat patients and care for people in really bad condition. And what we've also seen is the co-opting of healthcare professionals, often young and inexperienced healthcare professionals, into support the overall health system. And then the idea that AI can somehow also support those clinicians in this great fight against COVID. And one of the areas of applications, those who know about AI will know that one of the things AI does very well, can do very well, is pattern recognition. So looking at images and being able to recognize things from those images is something we can train AI to do very well. And that's an application we see in my journal a lot and is out there in use a lot. Training AI systems to look at lungs, images of lungs from various different types of scan, and then make triage decisions and diagnostic decisions on COVID patients has been something which is done, and certainly in the early days of COVID, became seen as a real boost to help clinicians dealing with this great pandemic. But what's beginning to emerge is that perhaps some of those applications weren't based on sound data, weren't necessarily given diagnostic decisions or diagnostic advice to clinicians, which were fully representative of the actual position of that patient. And then that leads you to AI being a tool being used, possibly by inexperienced clinicians against a disease they're not familiar with, making life and death decisions for patients, really on the basis of AI that's not necessarily robust. And I think anybody who works in AI, and indeed all of us in society, should be concerned about the rush to use AI in such situations when maybe the AI applications aren't as robust as we might think. And indeed, following on from that, from the original kind of diagnostic and triaging, we're also seeing AI systems being used for other parts of the healthcare process. So making a decision not only about whether or not this patient has COVID, what level of COVID, does this patient need to be hospitalized? Does this patient need to be transferred to ICU? Does this patient need to be ventilated and intubated? What kind of drugs would be best to give this patient? What kind of therapeutic treatments? So those are very, very, very profound decisions at the level of the individual, and being made not only by AI, of course, clinicians in the loop, but go back to that point about clinicians under great stress, dealing with massive problems in terms of resources, and often, dealing with a situation they've never seen before. And the AI tools being kind of perhaps too much of a crutch to lean on, and the possibility of decisions being made very much reliant on the AI rather than the AI being one of the things you would take into account. And I think that there have been examples of that all over the world. And I think that what all of that kind of encapsulates is an example where the possibility that AI is seen as a tool to fight the disease, and we all want that, but is then developed and rolled out so quickly that the efficacy and the safety of the AI is not necessarily tested to the level that it should be. And we would all want that. And the final thing I'll say around around COVID is also, we've seen in this country that it's been a very, very troubled journey to try and get a track and trace system. There's been a lot of discussion around that, and I'm not going to go into all elements of that, but the AI components of that are also a worry in terms of what happens to that technology in the future. Not so much in track and trace now, but there are certainly significant concerns about what would happen with the technology post-COVID. And you could argue that we rush to get these applications out into the field. We want, to be able to fight back the pandemic, and we all want that. But the problem is that the genie is then out of the bottle. You can't put that back. And whether that's in the diagnostic and health applications or indeed in track and trace, that the AI is then ubiquitous. It's all around us. And I'm going to mention a couple of things around that now. But certainly as far as COVID is concerned, I think the rush to get AI applications out, developing AI applications which are big data applications on small amounts of data, and small amounts of data which are not representative of the situation which we're all facing, is a deeply flawed proposition and brings a lot of questions and a lot of concerns. That takes me to the broader thing around AI. I have seen many applications of AI where I'm deeply impressed by the technological development and the way the AI has been applied. And I can be both impressed and concerned. I'll give you one example. A couple of years ago, I saw an application being presented by a Chinese academic who'd been working in collaboration with a Chinese company. And the application uses the dragonfly eye algorithm. For those that aren't familiar, there are many, many applications of AI which mimic nature in one form or another, whether they're mimicking human reasoning or other biological and natural evolved solutions to particular kinds of problems. And the dragonfly algorithm takes the idea of the dragonfly's eye being a compound eye. It can look at many images and it can assimilate them. And so it's a vision processing algorithm. And in this particular case, this algorithm is taking images from a variety of different sources, not always with permission, by the way. So CCTV, from social media, but also from sources such as mobile phones and even smart TVs and your laptop. And this algorithm is doing facial recognition. Colleagues might be aware that there have been quite a lot of concerns lately about how facial recognition is used, not only in terms of its the ethics and issues of privacy, but actually issues of things like bias. There have been a variety of applications of which involve facial recognition, which have caused deep concern around their bias towards particular ethnic images, for example. So this particular application in China, it impressed me greatly because of the way the technology had been used. Back in the 90s, when I was doing my early work, trying to do facial recognition from one static image offline was a hard task. And we all recognize now that facial recognition is standard technology in mobile phones, and it's all around us in all sorts of very positive applications, including things like security in airports and so forth. So, facial recognition can be a good thing. This particular application recognizes 1 million human faces in 3 seconds in real time. Now, that's an incredibly powerful application of technology. And I watched with great interest when this presentation was being done, and very, very, impressed by how the technology had been developed and the power of it, but also deeply concerned as to why was it being done. And I think that kind of brings me to the point of the kind of concluding point of this presentation, which is this. I think there's an argument that AI has become so ubiquitous and so powerful that, much like genetic science had to face 20, 25 years ago, some very profound questions about the future of the field. And indeed, in genetic science, some of the questions led to a lot of self-regulation, but also governance and even laws being put around what genetics and genetic scientists could or should do. And that's my point. My point is now that every time we use AI, we need to be thinking very carefully about how we're using it, about the benefits we get from AI, but also what the potential disbenefits are. And because the AI has become so powerful, the fact that you can do something doesn't mean to say that you should. And at the very least, if you're going to, you should be thinking very carefully about whether or not there are unintended consequences down the line. I've seen a number of instances over the last year or so where you might argue that that is a moral and ethical imperative, but it's become a commercial and financial imperative for businesses, because those who get it wrong discover you can't bolt AI ethics on afterwards. You simply can't do that. And what will happen is there'll be a penalty paid by businesses who get the application of AI wrong. So thinking very carefully about whether or not you should do something using AI in a particular way, what the connotations are, and then how you can do it, but do it right, I think is a real imperative. So thanks very much for listening. I know we've got other speakers and then we want to leave some time for questions and answers. So I'll hand over back to our presenter.